Hey everyone, I'm here with Jenai Auman. Jenai is a Filipina writer and author of Othered, Finding Belonging with a God Who Pursues the Hurt, Harmed, and Marginalized. Hi Jenai, how you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have you here. Tell us briefly what you do.
Yeah. So I am a writer. I am also an artist, and I am a seminary student on top of like the other hats I wear. I'm also
Yeah.
mom and wife and Texan. And so, but a lot of the work and the writing work that I do now, or vocationally, what I do now is just studying spiritual formation,
Mm.
particularly in partnership with my seminary, certainly. But
Yeah.
spiritual formation became an interest to me because of what I write about in Othered, which I'm sure we'll
Mm.
get into in a bit. Just
Mm-hmm.
essentially, what does holistic, healing,
Yeah.
healthy spiritual formation look like in
Yeah.
a world that tends to other one
Yeah.
another? And so, yeah, those are usually the waters that I'm swimming in day to
Yeah.
day,
Yeah.
just where my brain's at. So, yeah,
Yeah.
in a nutshell.
Yeah. That's great. Spiritual formation. That's a whole conversation too that I would love to have, and maybe we'll kind of get into that a little bit in this conversation. I think that'd
Oh,
be good.
maybe so. Yeah.
May I ask, like, where you're going to seminary? And
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I am at Northeastern Seminary. It's
okay.
located or kind of centered in the Rochester, New York area.
Oh,
So I
cool.
am a distance learning
Ah,
student. I'm in Houston, and that was kind of one of the hopes for me in seminary. I know I'm a woman entering seminary,
mm,
which in certain spaces that is kind of an uphill struggle. And I
yeah.
just wanted to find a place where I felt like all of me was welcome. And so I felt that at Northeastern. I love
Oh,
Northeastern. I
good.
feel like if you wanted me to talk 30 minutes about Northeastern Seminary, I totally could. But yeah,
That's great.
that's where I am.
That's great. Well, I'm glad you found a good place. This podcast is associated with Fuller, and of course,
Yeah.
Fuller's been affirming women in leadership for a long time, and so I'm glad you found a good place. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. All right. Well, let's talk about your book, Othered. But I want to. You have a really powerful and kind of infuriating story. As I was reading to it, I was like, oh, feeling this. And can you just kind of tell us the story that you kind of open with in the book, and because I think it helps us to understand kind of where you're coming from in terms of this.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd love to. It's not a fun story.
Mm-hmm.
But for those, like, if anyone's listening and if this is like at all, it like hurt or it just hurts to hear, please
Mm-hmm.
like take care of yourself. I usually start with that. Um, I'm okay. So I am okay with telling it. And
Yeah.
honestly, it's so funny that I open this. It's not funny, but it's interesting that I
Mm-hmm.
open the book with this story. I thought it was important because I didn't recognize how harmful this first day of work was until much later. Like I now looking back, I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, to hear you say that this is terrible is affirming for me. And for
Mm-hmm.
whatever reason, I couldn't see that it was terrible at the time. But
Hmm.
I opened the book with a story of my first day of work, going on staff with my former church,
Mm.
and what it was my first job after being a stay-at-home mom for a few years.
Mm.
This job and position, it didn't feel like a job because I had been a member of this church, I think at this point, 8 years now.
Yeah.
I helped plant the church. So I was a part of the church when the church itself was only 6 members. Um, in the state of Texas, when you form a nonprofit, you have to have 3 signing directors. I was one of those signing directors. And so
Mm.
it felt like coming home in a way,
Mm.
just going to my church in the middle of the week. And so but on my first day of work, before the first day of work officially started, and this was kind of coinciding with my first day, we had an executive director who wanted to start a Bible study,
Yeah.
just in an effort of, we wanted to talk about Christ-likeness, and he felt
Hmm.
like this will be a great way to build cohesion with a new staff member. And this Bible study was an hour before work started, and it was optional. So we were
Mm.
saying this is an optional, unpaid Bible study,
Mm.
and this is just a way that we can start our day, but off the clock. And so I showed up to this Bible study 5 minutes late. I kind of right. I had a 4-year-old son at the time who was really
Yeah.
struggling with being away from mom, and there were kind of a lot of big elephant tears at drop off, and I
Mm.
felt guilty. And any parent
Mhm.
who's ever had to
Yeah.
walk through that, I'm sure that resonates.
Yeah.
So I'm 5 minutes late. I don't think that's that big of a deal, but I was sitting down chatting with my fellow coworkers. We were waiting for another person who was also late, and I was telling them I'm really struggling kind of right now with like just the having to wrestle with the tears of my 4-year-old and now trying to open my body. I'm just trying to figure out a way to can I transition into this,
Mhm.
and sharing that vulnerably with my coworkers. And then the executive director comes in and he says, like, we're going to start now. And instead of opening our Bibles to Luke 1, which was the text for the day, he begins berating me and
Mm.
another female coworker. Uh, it's kind of hard to say that he was yelling. I don't know at what decibel level it is considered yelling. His
Mm.
voice is certainly raised.
Mm.
He's irate. You
Mm.
get the feeling. I
Yeah.
know 100% that this, and he's kind of talking down to us. We've undermined his leadership. And I thought this is an outsized response to
Yeah.
what happened. I'm a mom. I know what outsized responses look like. And so I thought this is a disproportionate response um, to what is occurring. And I thought, like, and I start speaking to him for a moment. I say,
Yeah.
I didn't do, I love and I appreciate you. My executive director was someone who I had spent a lot of time at his house. I actually helped
Mm.
decorate his house. I helped like
Wow.
tell him where to put stuff in his house. And like we were friends.
Hmm.
And I thought, this is not what I know of our friendship.
Yeah.
And I interject and I remind him, like, I am not trying to, I just had a hard morning. And he cuts me off and he keeps going, and it's just
Oh.
raised voices for
Mm.
many, many minutes. Um, Mind you, this is supposed to like be cohesive as a group, and I do not feel united to
Yeah.
someone who's yelling at me.
Yeah.
And then I write in the book that there's a moment where you can kind of see when someone realizes they've gone too far, and I see
Mm.
that like he's
Hmm.
kind of starting to backtrack, and he says, I had a hard morning this morning, and I need you to give me grace for being mad this morning. And I thought, I didn't write this in the book, but I
Yeah.
thought, man, why didn't I told you I had a hard morning?
Yeah.
Why couldn't you give me that
Yeah.
same grace that
Right.
you're asking for right now? Obviously, in the moment, I'm like, oh, absolutely, I will give you. It's essentially, I switch from this is a person that I can have a rational conversation with
Mhm.
to you are irate and I just need to kind of do whatever I need to do. Kind of like Black Widow in the
Yeah.
Avengers with the Hulk. I don't know if you're familiar with Marvel
Oh, yeah.
characters, but
100%.
she has to like kind of like
Yeah.
tell the Hulk, sun's getting real low, big
Yeah.
guy. She's trying
Right.
to do whatever she needs to do to disarm the situation. I find
Mm.
myself doing that.
Mm.
Um and then we open our Bibles to Luke 1 and we have a really uncomfortable conversation about Christ-likeness with Luke 1. And I thought, well,
Yeah.
I don't know how this is going to go. And
Yeah. Yeah.
that's essentially the gist of the story. And
Yeah.
it kind of, my time on staff devolves from there.
Yeah.
It takes me by surprise as well.
And you were on staff for about 3 years, is that right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So
And
I
it
was at the church a total of 11 years.
so as a attender and volunteer, a
Hmm.
parishioner or whatever
And
before
like a
that,
lay leader. Hmm.
a lay leader. Yeah, okay. Um, so this is your experience. I mean, there have been, and you share other experiences of being othered, but you're sort
Hmm.
of right from the start at this church, sort of set off to the side in a sense. There's us and me in particular, this leader, and you over there, right? And you have to abide by my rules. So a couple of ways. So there's two sides to this, so to speak. I don't mean, you'll see what I mean. There's the leader side, and then there's
Hmm.
the othered person side, right? And I think
Yeah.
both are worth exploring. Like, what's going on in him, and then what was going on in you. And okay, so this is Church Leadership Institute podcast for the Church Leadership Institute, so that we got a lot of pastors listening, and I'd love to explore what causes leaders to do that othering, and then what is the experience of those who are othered? Because it's not loving your neighbor, right? It's something other than that.
Yeah.
But what do you think was going on in this person that caused him to react that way to you?
I think, in a word, insecurity.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not just saying that as someone who, and sometimes I say executive director, and he wasn't a pastor, but I do speak of my experience with other pastors on staff. And whenever I'm discussing these guys, I think some folks think these guys are old enough to be my dad. I'm 37 now. I was 30 at the time. These guys were like, the oldest one was 9 years older than me. So like the age of brothers.
Yeah.
And I had been friends with them for years. I'd been friends with this particular executive director. Like I said, I would go over and decorate his house, hang out with his wife, who was also a friend. My kids had spent time in his house running around in his backyard. You know what I mean? Kind of like a friendship, like a family. And that's one of the that's the language that we used, was like, we are a family. And I kind of cleaved to that, like this idea of being a part of the family of God. And so whenever I say, what he did wasn't right, and because I knew him, and I am at the point in my healing journey where I have compassion on him, I can see it was insecurity.
Yeah.
It was a lot of insecurity. I think there's a lot of insecurity about wondering, do I measure up? And if he's already asking that question, do I measure up? And there's two staff members who work under him who showed up 5 minutes late to a volunteer Bible study. It just seemed like a trigger of something. It really wasn't about us being late. There was something else there. Like I said, it was a disproportionate, outsized response. And it was weird to hear him ask for grace. And I thought, man, like, it would have been really cool for you to model grace. And instead, now I had just spent, 5 extra minutes parenting my 4-year-old. I feel like right now I have to step into a parental mothering role for you. And that is not my job right here. But, in a word, insecurity for sure.
Yeah. And then what was your experience on this? So you offered him grace, and maybe you thought, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, but well, maybe this is a one-off. Maybe he's just really having a bad day and this is unusual. Was that a thought that maybe you were having in that moment? Yeah.
Yes, I think I did have that thought, because I hadn't ever experienced him in that way before. And if anything, I think in the moment, I am confused. In retrospect, I see a pattern of my experience, my perspective is less valuable than the perspective of a person in power. That's how I would kind of generalize it now in hindsight. At the time, I couldn't have given you that sort of language. At the time, I would have just said, okay, we embody the goodness we want to see in the world. And in this way, I get to embody the goodness of grace.
Right.
I get to model that. And so I kind of gave him grace. And it was only over this Bible study, continued weekly for the next few weeks. It did not go well. We weren't giving the answers that he wanted to have. And I thought, that's not a Bible study. That is whatever you're wanting. That's not a Bible study. If there are particular answers and you've not given me the review sheet, you've already set me up for failure. And I at this point, I'm pretty frustrated and spicy. And I thought, this is not a Bible study, and I am not paid to be here also. And this is so unlike so many of the other good, healthy Bible studies I've been a part of. And so I think at the time I would have just said, I'm confused. And I would stay confused until I started to acknowledge this is a pattern, and I am no longer confused. Now I have words to define my experience.
Yeah. I want to get to kind of talking about being othered and the act of othering kind of more generally and broadly so that anyway, for all kinds of circumstances. But maybe just finish your story. What happened and what led to, yeah, just kind of how does that story conclude? Because you were there for 3 more years.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll hit the high points.
Yeah.
Our executive director, I mentioned he's a very strong personality. He's not the only strong personality on staff, and over the course of time, I would watch them butt heads.
Mm.
It was really like walking on eggshells in that environment. Executive director would eventually leave.
Mm-hmm.
I think be asked to leave. He'd
Mm-hmm.
stepped down. And he was given other positions of power and leadership in the church that seemed
Yep.
to placate him. And then the power void that was left behind had kind of been gobbled up by another particular, it was just another, it was our main pastor on staff. And what I experienced over time was maybe a more covert way of being, like, he never raised his voice, but like low key manipulation, and just a consistent breaking of trust over and over. One of the things that I experienced on staff meetings, we would usually, have everyone share what had been happening in their life. And we'd share this in confidence with our staff to like basically be there for one another. And I would find some of my stories that I shared in confidence included in sermons on a Sunday without permission.
Wow.
And my husband would look at me and he would say, that sounds oddly specific to something we're walking through. And I thought, you're right.
Wow. So he didn't name you, but he named the stuff.
No. Yeah. And I
Wow.
thought, why do I have to be an object in
Yeah.
an object lesson in your, and I just felt really, I felt very used,
Yeah.
just to kind of put a word to it.
Yeah.
And not only used in that way, like my story was used almost as if it were like anything that I used vulnerably, it was like cannon fodder for a sermon, but also used in terms of, give us your vulnerability. And also the burnout culture in our church was extraordinary. The number of things that we had, and Houston, Texas is a ton of mega churches. I would not have called ourselves a mega church for sure. I think at this point our membership's like 300, so not small, but not enormous either.
Yeah.
We had a staff of about 6 to 7 people, like vacillating between 6 to 7, and it was kind of all hands on deck, except again, whenever you started to see a pattern, your first year at a job, everything's kind of new.
Yeah.
By year 2, you're like, hey, this is not new, but you start to see that, like that pattern that I mentioned.
Yeah.
By year 3, I'm seeing some of the same stuff day in and day out. And I thought, this is not okay. I had advocated for myself many times in terms of, I can't work at 10 p.m. I can't address, insurance questions via text message at 10 p.m., just kind of like a lot of boundary crossing. And I realized that if you've let that happen over a period of time and you start kind of erecting those boundaries, you start to feel like they made me the problem for saying no. Because they were so used to my yes.
Right.
And when I started advocating for myself, I remember telling them, parts of this job are killing me and I just need your help. I need you to be gracious to me. And over the course of time, being more adamant about saying, no, I can't take this on. And then being told that I was harsh and abrasive for pointing at the problem. Rather than, it was easier to make me the problem than to actually address the systemic problems. And so, that's kind of a high level. I wouldn't shut up essentially about like what needed to change and the repentance that, like, it was hard to see just, every Sunday of the year, hear messages of grace and truth and love, and then not experience that the other days of the week. And so I, at some point, had enough and said, things have to change. And they said, things are not going to change. The only thing that's going to change is we're getting you out of here.
Wow.
And that was really hard to hear from brothers.
Yeah. One of the things that kind of struck me was that you stayed as long as you did, because, of course, from the outside, you're like, why wouldn't you just leave? But I'm sure there's all kinds of stuff
Yeah.
behind the staying, and maybe you can sort of expand to the experience of being othered in general. Why do people stay in situations where they're being othered?
Yeah. The short answer is they want to belong, and they
Hmm.
have a very shallow definition of love,
Hmm.
or they've been
Hmm.
conditioned to accept a very shallow
Hmm.
definition of love.
Okay.
Almost as if my undergrad is in behavioral health, and so and I also kind of witnessed and am a domestic violence survivor from my family
Hmm.
of origin, and
Hmm.
so I know exactly what it is to have to stay in a place that's unsafe.
Hmm.
I would say, if anything, my history had conditioned me to stay in a
Wow.
place
Wow.
that was unsafe because,
Yeah.
especially as a place where God's name is attached to it.
Hmm.
And I thought, well, faithfulness means, like white knuckling it through this. And this is what grace looks like. Never
Hmm.
stopping to think, like, what does grace toward me look like? When am
Yeah.
I going to see that?
Yeah.
And so a lot of people stay because they have a very shallow definition of belonging, of
Hmm.
love, and thankfully God's healed that within me. But yeah, I think you so desperately want to believe that things will change,
Yeah.
and that you think. I mean, this is what happens with domestic violence and abuse survivors. Like, the person hurting me actually really loves me. They don't mean to hurt
Hmm.
me. And so
Hmm.
I kind of quote Dr. Jennifer Freud. She does a lot of research in betrayal trauma, and I kind
Hmm.
of quote some of her work in the book. And she has this phrase that she coined called betrayal blindness, almost as if, like, you can't see the betrayal because you keep making it make sense in your
Yeah.
head,
Yeah.
even though it doesn't make sense at
Yeah.
all. And so, yeah, the othering, I think over time was used to being made to feel less than,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think the part of me that knew that it was wrong was the part that kept speaking up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't think, honestly, had they not gotten rid of me, I probably would have still stayed
Hmm.
and still tried to, there's, I think so many of us want to stay and fix the system from the inside.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
I would have burned myself out trying to
Hmm.
fix it from the inside.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I mean, would you say, looking back, that it was for you, as hard as it was, kind of transformative for you? I mean,
Oh,
having come through it?
100%.
Yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. Say something about that.
Now I've kind of like, I've done a lot of these interviews, and
Hmm.
even just talking about my story, now I've kind of, I speak about that as like, these are the wounds I did not want.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, and despite these being the wounds I did not want, it gave me the wisdom I needed.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's so funny. What is it in James 1, where if anyone lacks wisdom, ask God, and he gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to you. And I have prayed for wisdom. I just didn't know it was going to come in this form. I
Yeah.
don't think any of us knows how the wisdom is going to arrive, but I think a lot of the wisdom we receive is through our experience,
Yeah.
and hopefully, getting on the other side of that experience, if you can look back in hindsight with love of the people who hurt you the most,
Yeah.
I
Mm.
think that's where wisdom, and I think that's practicing resurrection.
Yeah.
That's exactly
Yeah.
what Jesus had did, and he didn't hide his wounds. Like, whenever
Yeah.
he came back, the scars were still in his hands, and so my scars are not visible,
Yeah.
um, but they are scars, and they are still there.
Yeah.
And I try not to do to others what was done to me.
Mm.
I think that is walking in repentance, is
Yeah. Yeah.
not becoming I think I write about this, not becoming the hammer that hurt me. And so
Mm.
it was transformative. And there was a part of me that was a little bit, there's a little bit of, there was a lot of anger, and a
Mhm.
lot of, I tell people sometimes I was petty and I would just get mad. Sometimes I would be bitter. And I think God in the silence of like the space that existed for a while, God gave me the space I needed to work through that,
Hmm.
so that my anger wouldn't come out sideways, or my bitterness
Yeah.
wouldn't come out sideways and hurt other people who were not at all involved in the situation. So yes,
Yeah.
100% transformative for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting to me, having been through some of my own hard experiences, including some othering that I've experienced in a church. It is those experiences, because it's a kind of death and resurrection, right?
Mhm.
If you can move through it in a healthy way, and if trusting in the true your true belovedness, right? If you
Yeah.
can move through it, um, there is something powerful and transformative. Like, and I'm sure you would agree. Like the things that I've been through, I don't ever want to go through those things again.
No.
But I wouldn't be who I am now had I not been through my own experiences of othering. Would you agree with that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
I kind of have a greater sense of, these are the places that I am welcome to experience mutuality, reciprocity,
yeah,
divine love even,
yeah,
and these are the spaces where this is maybe beyond, like, I kind of have a better idea of what safety is, and, sometimes discomfort, we say discomfort when we really mean unsafe. Discomfort can be like a two-way. There's good discomfort in that you're growing, you're
yeah,
being challenged. But for those of us, particularly with those of us who have had backgrounds, like really hard, traumatic childhood backgrounds, discomfort is not just growth or challenge. It's actually
yeah.
like a lack of safety, a lack of shalom. And so it transformed a lot of like how I reframe and like it changed my worldview in many
Yeah,
ways.
yeah,
And it gave me greater language to what it really means to love your neighbor
yeah,
and love your enemy.
yeah, yeah,
The enemy that who still does not like you. Yeah, it's
yeah,
super, super transformative for sure.
yeah. Um, One of the things that you say is that it's really important for people to name when they are
Mhm.
being othered. Can you talk a little bit about that? Why that's so important?
Yeah.
And
Well,
let me say, we're nearing 30 minutes, but I feel like if you got another 10 minutes in you, can we go a little bit further? Is that
oh,
okay? This is great.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
good.
I would say that, like, it's important, and I say this in the book, um, but if you go to a doctor, and for
Hmm.
those who maybe wrestle with, like, unknown illnesses, who have
Hmm.
seen 10 different doctors, they've gone to get second opinions and third opinions, and when you don't have a diagnosis, you have no treatment plan, and so you're just living with the symptoms of the disease that keeps you confused, um, and surely, like, the sometimes the diagnoses that people receive aren't great, but at least they have a name, and then you can at least kind of put generative action into a plan to begin to feel shalom in your body again.
Yeah.
And while that is physical chronic illnesses, I think something is similar to emotional, mental, psychological wounds that we receive. If we don't name them, then we don't have a treatment plan. We don't know what healing looks like. We don't know what holiness looks like. We don't know what integrity looks like.
Yeah.
And we don't know what integrity or wholeness look like because our existence is perpetually fractured and is being fractured
Mhm.
by the othering that we experience. And just to give people like a quick definition, othering, and I didn't coin this term, there's actually a lot of research from philosophers, if you want to go all the way back into the 1800s,
Hmm.
but also John Powell with the Othering and Belonging Institute. They aren't a
Hmm.
Christian organization, but they do a lot of work in that arena. Othering is essentially it's exclusion So it's the opposite of belonging. It's exclusion, but not only exclusion, it's exclusion with a value statement that says this person is less human than
Yeah.
these others that deserve more care. And
Yeah.
because they are less human, they deserve less care,
Yeah.
less compassion, less love, which is absolutely counter to the message of the gospel. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's why I argue that othering in the church, othering that's become so normal. It's so
Yeah.
normal to see it in our society. And I believe that like naming the othering you experience is if you don't go if you go on with it unnamed. I'm sorry, I'm like stumbling
No,
over my words
go
because I
on.
think,
Yeah.
whenever your words are like
Yeah.
a thousand words are in your brain all
Yeah.
at once, but
Yeah.
when you continue through life without naming it,
Yeah.
then you still live a very fractured
Yeah.
existence. And I don't think that that is the shalom of God, the peace
Yeah.
of God, the wholeness
Yeah.
of God that He
Yeah.
wants us to experience
Yeah.
as the body of Christ. And not only are we, within ourselves feeling a fractured sense of self, which I think contributes to that insecurity, that perpetuates more insecurity, um, but it fractures us as the body of Christ. And that's not what God wants for his church either. And so I think it's so pivotal to name it because then we can move into generative mending
Yeah.
action as agents of reconciliation. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Agents of reconciliation, right, which kind of points us towards the solution. The solution. I don't know if that's the right word, but the healing, right, the
Yeah.
restoration. And you talk about shalom, and you talk about hesed in the book as
Mhm.
well. Maybe unpack those two. I'd love for you to unpack shalom and hesed a little bit, and what's shalom? Why does it matter? And what's hesed? And how does that help us when we're being othered? But also, what does that teach us if we're in a position where we might other someone? Also, maybe unintentionally, right? A lot of
Yeah.
times, a side note here, but I want to go back to Shalom and Hesed, right? Sometimes we think, oh, I'm not racist, I'm not sexist, so I
Mm.
don't other people, right? But it's more subtle than that.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's a whole conversation too. But let's talk about Shalom and Hesed, and if you want to say something about the subtle ways that we do it, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember how I stumbled onto this was before I was in seminary and how I stumbled onto Hesed and how
Hmm.
I just remember reading more about this and I thought I've never read anything about this. And so I kind of became obsessed with like studying it and I realized, "Oh my gosh, this is so beautiful." This
Mm,
and how imperfect the translation of Hesed is in the Bible. It can be
mm,
grace, it can be mercy, but it's actually
yeah.
so much more encompassing. And
Yeah.
I feel like Hesed is, um, and maybe if folks read the book, they'll realize that I get kind of obsessed with the word Hesed because I think
Hmm.
God really wanted to show us this. We're so often shown this, Old Testament God that was wrathful and judgment, like he was, sending judgment, but there is an underlying Hesed compassion. And so I really appreciate the translation of Hesed that is loving kindness,
Yeah.
the single compound word loving kindness, because I think from the fall when everything
Yeah.
fell apart. Everything became fractured. Our relationship with God was fractured. Our relationship with one another is fractured. Our relationship with animals, with the created world, with the land that we're
Hmm.
on, it's all fractured. And
Hmm.
because it's fractured, everything there tends to be an exploitation,
Mm,
not only an exploitation of the land or of animals, but also an exploitation of one another, which is
hmm.
a part of the othering
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
And so the Hesed of God, I see as there are scriptures in the Psalms where it says he keeps us, he
Mm,
holds us,
hmm.
he's behind and before us.
Yeah.
When I look, he stirs me to the left and to the right, and I just see this Hesed of God as like his hands
Hmm.
really gently guiding us,
Yeah.
kind of like a parent whose kid is just now starting to walk, and they're like, "Oh
Hmm.
my!" You're so excited, and you don't want to touch them, but your hands
Yeah.
are there
Yeah.
because it's loving kindness. And so this Hesed I see is like the compassion of God, who is really wanting
Yeah.
wholeness for us.
Yeah.
And because we live in a fractured world with fractures within us, we tend to hoard
Yeah.
comfort and we
Mm,
take for it, we think in a zero-sum game, we often think what exists in the world is what exists. There's not abundance.
Yeah.
So if I want peace, I need to take that peace. And whatever peace I take, that means somebody else can't have it. Or if someone else takes these resources that, may stir peace within us, that means
Yeah.
I won't have it if they have it.
Yeah.
And so we start competing with one another
Yeah.
for these resources. And I really see the shalom of God and the hesed of God as bringing us back toward wholeness and mending those fractures within us.
Yeah.
In the shalom of God, it's no longer a zero-sum game.
Hmm.
Things start multiplying. And I
Yeah.
think that was a part of the original blessing. Be fruitful and
Yeah.
multiply.
Yeah.
There wasn't a deficit, and
Yeah.
now we live, post Jesus. I think a part of like blessing the world is going out and making disciples, sure,
Yeah.
but also multiplying the qualities of God within us and
Yeah.
between us, such that the fruit of the Spirit is alive among us,
Yeah.
and a watching world picks up on
Hmm.
it. I feel like I've hit shalom and hesed from like several different
Yeah.
angles, but I hope that gets to like the heart of your question.
Yeah, no, 100%. When we not just understand that, like the loving kindness of God, the healing and the wholeness, that's what I think of when I think of shalom, the well-being of God in the world, the peace, of course. But if we're living that out, othering is not an option, right?
Mm,
Because our arms are open, our hands are open to one another. I like to think of it I think of open-handedness and tight-fistedness
yeah.
as the people are crossing the wilderness. He's like, be open-handed, not tight-fisted, which is not just about generosity, but it's about our postures towards one another.
Mm,
And God has an open-handed posture towards us, which I think hesed and shalom are a part of that, right? And he doesn't have a tight-fisted posture towards us. And the more that we experience the open-handedness of God, I think the more and our belovedness, right? That's really what it comes to. We're able to then be open-handed towards one another, and
yeah.
that's when othering stops, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I think othering stops when you say openness, one of the words that kind of a spaciousness. He
Mm-hmm.
brings me into a broad place.
Yeah.
Just this idea that there's a broad place that we all get to dwell within.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, and then this is from Joshua, like he grants us rest on every side. There's no longer fighting or trying to conquer one another. Like we are exactly where we need to be, and there's rest on every side. It's this. I wouldn't wish othering on anyone, and I know
Mm-hmm.
that there are other instances where I'm going to experience that,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't have to trigger me into doing like othering back, because once you're brought into this broad, expansive place,
Yeah.
once you have a more spacious sense of spirituality and spiritual formation, I think that you are able to welcome in those who are so unlike you,
Yeah.
even those with a
Yeah.
totally different worldview.
Yeah.
Their very strange or different worldview or perspective doesn't at all threaten me,
Yeah.
because my personhood, my identity, my belonging is rooted in the hesed,
Yeah.
shalom, resurrected love of God.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that, I think, is how we make how we become people of welcome.
Yeah. I love that. Um, let's come to a conclusion here. This is such a good conversation. I have like 20 more questions about just stuff that I drew from the book, but we're not going to get into all of that. People can go read it, right? It's but like vulnerability and Darvo and
Mm,
right, all those kinds of things, all of which could be a 30 to 60-minute conversation too. But what would you say to two different groups of people? If someone is feeling othered or think maybe I'm being othered here, what kind of words of encouragement or advice or whatever would you give to them? So let's start with that. What would you say to someone who feels like they might be being othered?
yeah, if you feel like you're being othered, a very natural reaction is defensiveness,
Hmm.
or in that defensiveness you try to convince other people that you matter. And I try to encourage people, you are beloved, you are loved, you are wanted, you don't have to convince anyone. I mean, I
Mm.
understand that you feel like this particular person needs to be convinced. That's not your job. And if they've already made you less than, every word you say will be less than to them. And so they will likely not hear you. And so hard work of healing, sometimes we convince people because we ourselves need to be convinced.
Mhm.
So I usually say stop and do what you need to do to take care of yourself.
Yeah.
Think about the yoke that you've been carrying and think about what you potentially need to put down to feel the comfort of Christ. Because I do believe that is assured and given to us. He so much as says that his yoke is easy and his burden is light.
Yeah.
So what do you need to release that is not your responsibility so that you can experience that love for sure?
Yeah. And then what would you say to someone, a church leader who maybe they're like, oh, maybe I'm othering that person and I didn't mean to, or maybe they're feeling defensive as they're listening to this because maybe they're realizing there's some othering going on that they're engaging in. And if maybe think of those listeners who are like, how can I be the kind of person who doesn't other? And maybe if I have, what should I do? If I have othered someone, what should I do? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I think for anyone, we hardly ever believe that we are othering people. So often othering happens in the name of, well, I have to say something because this person is dangerous. And if we let what they're saying come to, or just catch on, or find more ears who listen, they will threaten the church. And I just want to say that God does not need us on his. We are invited into sharing the good news. No one will be more effective in his protection of the church than God. So God does not need us to defend him.
Yeah.
And so normally I say, like, what is within, what insecurity within you is rising up in the presence of this other person?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's not only about that. Like I said in the beginning with my executive director, it's not only about what's happening in front of us. We are not only engaging people in a particular context. We are engaging people who are sharing their ideas, and they have that idea because of the story they've lived. So what does having compassion in this moment, what I usually ask myself 3 questions in conflict. What does self-compassion look like in this moment? What does shepherding look like in this moment? And what does shalom look like in this moment?
Yeah.
Sometimes I do not need to shepherd in this particular context. Sometimes I need to let myself be shepherded, if not by a person, then by God. Sometimes I need to experience self-compassion and quell the insecurity within me so I can extend compassion and love to my neighbor.
Yeah.
And then shalom, I just think sometimes people have their ideas because of, we just went through a whole political process where, fear is incited often.
Yeah.
And that fear often exists because of the stories that people have lived.
Yeah.
So I often think about, what sort of fracturing has this person experienced in their story? And how can I bring shalom into it without being defensive and without minimizing